Hello and welcome everyone to our monthly WFO webinar. My name is Ilya Karnoukhov and I'm a development manager at the World Forum Offshore Wind. And today's WFO webinar is on offshore wind market updates in Norway, the US and Vietnam. It's my great pleasure to welcome our three excellent speakers today. We have Johan Sandberg, the head of business development at Aker Offshore Wind. We have Nasheena Laing as research analyst of Asia Pacific at Energy Industries Council, and Brendan Burke, director of policy and outreach at the Business Network for Offshore Wind. And before we jump into the presentation, let me tell you a few things about our WFO organization. The organization was founded in 2018, and we're a non-profit organization focused on offshore wind energy only, promoting offshore wind energy worldwide, and our members represent the complete offshore wind value chain. And we have an international set of offices in Hamburg and Singapore. In terms of WFO activities, it's very straightforward. We focus on three things. We lobby for offshore wind worldwide. We inform about offshore wind via all our media channels, and we connect the global offshore wind community by doing events. Of course, in our days, mostly online, but physical events soon again in the future, as we hope. As for our members, we're very happy to have a broad range of global members from around the world, which you can see on this slide. We're very delighted to have so many companies from all segments of value chain, and also from all regions around the world, from North America, Europe, Asia, and even Australia. And if you're not a member yet of WFO, please make sure to join us and check out our website and contact Gunnar Hersik, our managing director. If you have any question regarding the membership, please do not hesitate to reach us. That's all from my side for the WFO introduction. And before I'm handing over to our first speaker, Johan Sandberg, I would like to let you know that you have any question for our three speakers, we're going to have Q&A session at the very end of the webinar. And please feel free to submit your question through the chat function on the control panel on the right-hand side. And without any further ado, Johan, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ilya. Just wonder now, can you see my screen?
Yes.
Yeah. I'll put it into presentation mode. Is it in presentation mode now?
Yes.
Very good. Okay, thank you very much for inviting me here. My name is Johan Sandberg. I'm head of business development in Aker Offshore Wind. I'll just make a brief introduction to us as a company, and I will be talking about the Norwegian market, the Norwegian offshore wind market, which is an interesting market currently sort of under development. So Aker Offshore Wind is a company that was formed last year. We were previously a group within a company called Aker Solutions, and we were separated out from Aker Solutions last summer and listed on the stock exchange here in Oslo in Norway. We have a dedicated focus to the deep water segment of the offshore wind market, where we think that we can make a difference based on our heritage from particularly from the oil and gas industry and the maritime industries. And we have a pretty strong focus on floating wind turbines, floating wind turbine technology. We do, however, also look at deep water bottom fixed wind as well. So at this point in time, we have four main sort of markets where we have projects or prospects we're working on. I'll have a little map here. So if we start from the east, we have a project in South Korea together with our partner there. It's called KF Wind, the company there. We have a project in California together with Ocean Winds, and we have two prospects, basically one in Scotland and one in Norway. So as you might have heard, the process in Scotland has been postponed a little bit by the governments there. And the process here in Norway and the market here in Norway is basically what I will be talking about shortly. So we also own a fairly large part of the company Principal Power. We own approximately 47% of the company, and it's a technology that we have great belief in, and that we will be hopefully continuing to work with and develop further. Aker Solutions and the Aker group of companies have a tremendous track record in semi-submersible technologies from oil and gas, and that is something that we think we can leverage upon when we now move into the offshore wind business. So the floating structures, the mooring systems, anchors, the cabling systems, and so on, that is something we have a lot of experience on from oil and gas. And as you probably know, this design, the wind float design, it has been installed in Portugal, 3 units, 8 megawatt units, and a few units also now installed in Kincardine outside Scotland with a 9.5 megawatt machine. So the largest machines on the market pretty much installed today. So that takes me to Norway and the 2 projects that are currently open for applications in Norway. One of them is called Sørlige Nordsjø 2, which you can see on the map in the south. It's basically right on the border to the Danish waters, and it's also quite close to some of the large offshore oil and gas installations in this region of the North Sea. The total theoretical capacity of Sørlige Nordsjø 2 is 3 gigawatts. And the water depth here is a pretty challenging one, because it's a deep site for a bottom fixed, but it's also shallow for a floating technology. So the water depth is around 60 meters here. So it will be interesting to see which direction the market will develop this site, but it can certainly be suitable for deep water bottom fixed, so probably jackets. Or potentially maybe some floating solutions as well for Sørlige Nordsjø 2. The other site is the one further up to the north, a bit closer to shore, outside the city Haugesund. It is called Utsira Nord, and it is a deeper site, so this is only suitable for floating turbines. I think the capacity for Utsira Nord is 1.5 gigawatts. And the distance to shore here is some 50 kilometers roughly. The status of development is so that it has been open for applications, but the rules for how to evaluate applications has not yet been released, or the guidelines. But that is expected to come this spring. So we're all basically waiting for the Norwegian authorities to release these guidelines, so that we can then start preparing and sending in applications for the projects. I thought I'd also share this picture that shows the oil and gas installations in the region. Norway has a fairly low power price compared to many other countries and regions in Europe, so it is currently not expected to be possible to export the power into the Norwegian electricity market without any kind of subsidies. So either we will have to wait for the Norwegian government to agree on a subsidy system for these offshore wind projects, or we will have to look at alternative solutions for the power offtake. So as you can see on this slide, there are quite many oil and gas installations in the North Sea, and they are potential off-takers for power. Norway has a fairly ambitious target to decarbonize the economy, and these platforms is basically outlining a fairly substantial part of the current emissions from the Norwegian economy. We obviously also have installations in other countries that are quite close as well. So in the UK sector and in the Danish sector, we also see quite many oil and gas installations that could be potential off-takers from these projects. So the rationale for Norway to build offshore wind is not primarily to produce much more power into the system, but to make a transition of the value chain of suppliers in Norway. The Norwegian economy is very much driven by oil and gas activities, and the supply chain around the coastlines of Norway is very much depending on oil and gas projects. So it's a clear ambition of the Norwegian government to transition these yards and suppliers towards the renewable sector. So these offshore wind projects are basically one of those main sort of drivers to take us through that transition. So we see a number of opportunities in the supply chain. Obviously, many of them have great overlaps with what is already there in oil and gas. We see, for instance, the jacket foundations. We see the power cables. We see the power systems with the substations. And for instance, oil and gas has already developed subsea substations for AC. We think that can be a potential opportunity for offshore wind to also adapt that type of technology. And of course, we see the floating structures and marine operations and so on that will all have great overlaps from oil and gas into offshore wind. So as a conclusion, we think that this is obviously a very exciting opportunity for the Norwegian market and the Norwegian industry. We see a lot of exciting interfaces between value chains. In this picture, you can also see, for instance, aquaculture. That could be a potential other type of value chain that can be integrated with offshore wind. We see, as I mentioned, subsea substations or floating substations, and we can probably also see hydrogen production and a sort of green fuel for shipping, for instance. So we think that there are many exciting opportunities here in the Norwegian market, and we look forward to hear more from the government on how this is going to be developed going further. Thank you very much.
Okay, excellent. Thank you very much, Johan, for this great presentation. I think it was a very comprehensive overview of the recent developments of the country. Thank you very much. And now it's my great pleasure to introduce our next speaker. Nasheena, the floor is yours. Good. Nasheena, sound?
How about now? Could you hear me?
Yeah, yes, now it's great. Thank you.
All right, perfect. So as I mentioned earlier on, first of all, I want to thank World Forum Offshore for the invitation to speak. And I'm really glad to be here to be able to touch on the Vietnamese offshore wind market, because Vietnam is definitely one of the hottest wind markets in Southeast Asia. And I really believe that it's not just because of the vast wind resources, but also because of the government support in terms of advancing this sector. So before I delve into the more interesting bits on the market, just allow me to introduce who we are as a company. So the Energy Industries Council, we are one of the leading trade association, and we have been in the industry since 1943. And our main goal is to help members to first understand, identify, and pursue business opportunities globally. We are a not-for-profit organization with a membership of over 700 companies who basically deliver goods and services to the energy industries worldwide. We provide our market intelligence to our members through our online energy project database, which are the EIC data stream, the EIC asset map, and also EIC supply map. So on top of that, we also hold events that are designed to the global opportunities, and also at the same time provide an opportunity for our members to gain more exposure. So just to give a brief overview on the offshore wind sector in the Asia Pacific region. So basically the sector in the region is still relatively new as compared to Europe, which is already almost a generation ahead. But right now, we've been seeing the Asian market quickly becoming the next epicenter of the sector, which is largely led by China. As you can see on the graph, Other offshore wind growth markets in the region includes Taiwan, South Korea, Vietnam, and also Japan. Countries such as Australia, the Philippines, and India as well are slowly developing their offshore wind sector. And China is expected to continue to dominate the market share up to 2025, but it will slowly reduce when projects from the other growth markets gets connected. And one of the main drivers of the offshore wind sector is the initiatives by the governments, basically in setting up targets. So for examples, we have Japan, who is targeting 10 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030. And then we have South Korea, 12 gigawatts by 2030. So with these targets being coupled with technology advancement, it would definitely be a prime catalyst for sector deployment. The offshore wind market in the Asia Pacific region is actually mainly dominated by bottom fixed foundations, but there is huge potential for a floating market. So Japan, for example, is really exploring the floating option. This is basically due to its high exposure to earthquakes, and in terms of geographical, they have very deep waters close to shore. And Japan has already launched its first offshore wind auction in Goto City last year in July. And another trend that we have been seeing in the region is the oil and gas players. They are starting to diversify their business and integrating transferable skill sets into the renewable sector. So a good example would be Aker Offshore earlier on. So with the likes of Total as well, Total, Equinor, Shell, and even Vietnam's state oil company, Petro Vietnam, they already have plans to foray into the renewable sector, and they already have a target of 900 megawatts by 2035. So funneling our focus to the Vietnam offshore wind sector. So the country is planning to install about 6 gigawatts of wind capacity by 2030. But a target of 10 gigawatts has already been proposed based on the country's offshore wind potential. So in order to further accelerate the growth of the offshore wind sector, the Vietnamese government will be releasing its long-awaited Power Development Plan 8. So this plan is basically aims to raise the renewable energy capacity and shift away from fossil fuel. So this is definitely a huge step towards achieving the country's 20% renewable energy target by 2030. And in terms of policy, the current feed-in tariff rate is set to expire in November 2021, and it will then transition to an auction scheme. However, the Ministry of Industry and Trade is right now pushing for a 2-year extension for the scheme, and they have already proposed a new feed-in tariff rate for this is specifically for intertidal and nearshore projects. So this will see a reduction of 13.6% in the tariff. So although this is a good effort by MYT, but it's a bit worrying because this drastic reduction will likely lead to the hindrance of the growth and also the derailment of the investment, especially in new and planned offshore wind projects. Though we have large-scale offshore projects, offshore wind projects, that has been a major topic of the town right now, we are currently seeing numerous intertidal and nearshore projects being proposed and developed. These are projects that are very close to shore and are in shallow waters. And nearly 3/4 of the offshore wind projects that are expected to be connected towards 2025 are intertidal and nearshore projects. To touch also on a bit on Vietnam's local supply chain, basically the locals, they have a vast experience in the oil and gas sector, but particularly in the upstream segment. And this skill set can actually be integrated into the offshore wind industry. And the locals also have capabilities such as in the balance of plant scope, which includes civil works, foundations, transmission line, substations, even O&M, as well as installation. So though we see that Vietnam's offshore wind industry has really great potential, but there are challenges that needs to be addressed. And one of the initial challenges is to streamline the permitting and planning processes. Although we have the MYT, who is taking a key role in approving and managing the projects that's coming in, there still isn't a single nodal agency that is responsible for the development and regulation of these projects. And another issue that we've been seeing is that the grid capacity remains biggest bottleneck for the renewable development. And the transmission development has long been within the domain of EVN. Whilst we have private activities and investment that is currently occurring, a regulatory framework has yet to be finalized. So just to share a bit on the key offshore wind projects in our database, just to highlight some of it, towards the end of last year, one of the large-scale project has came under the radar. So this is the 2 gigawatts Bindin offshore wind project, which is to be developed by PNE, which is a German renewable company. So the plan is to have the first 700 megawatts phase, which is basically considered as the pilot phase of the project. It is targeted to begin construction in 2024. And it is valued at approximately $1.6 billion out of the overall $4.8 billion of investment. And another project that I'd like to highlight is the 500 megawatts Ben Tre project. This project is proposed by Mainstream Renewables. And this company has really been showing a major interest in the country and is already involved in one of the large-scale projects in Vietnam, which is the Phu Trong Offshore Wind project. So for the Ben Tre project, the final investment decision as well as construction is targeted to begin between 2023 to 2024. So that is all from me, but before I end my presentation, I just want to give a quick highlight on the EIC Insight Report on the global offshore wind. So this we had released last year, and we are currently in the midst of preparing an updated version, which will be released sometime this year. So definitely watch this space. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nasheena. Yeah, thank you very much for your excellent presentation. It's very nice to hear any recent developments in Vietnam. It sounds as a very exciting market, and thank you very much. And the next presenter is Brendan. So without any further delay, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Ilya. It's great to be here, and thank you to the WFO for having the Business Network on this morning. I'm going to give you a quick overview of the U.S. market, as well as an introduction to the Business Network for Offshore Wind. And I'm coming to you right now from snowy, actually, Philadelphia in Pennsylvania. So first about the Business Network, we're a 501c3 nonprofit and a membership-based organization, and we're exclusively focused on developing the U.S. offshore wind industry as well as a domestic supply chain to serve offshore wind projects. We've brought together 9,000 individuals from nearly 2,000 different companies at 81 network events, and we currently have about 335 members. But that number is growing every day, and trust me, it is literally every day at this point. Now, I'd like to touch on a couple of things briefly that the network does before I dive into the market update. In addition to being the Policy and Outreach Director for the Business Network for Offshore Wind, I also produce and host the network's podcast, which is called Offshore Wind Insider. That's available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, as well as the network's website, which is offshorewindus.org. And elsewhere. And that podcast has been downloaded more than 24,000 times in the 2 years that we've been doing it. And we have listeners on 6 continents, and rest assured, we're working on getting into the Antarctic market. And we're always looking for episode sponsors, so please do reach out to me if that's something you're interested in. The Offshore Wind Market Dashboard is another product that we've been working on and something that I've been working on personally. It's a one-stop shop for everything that's going on in the U.S. offshore wind industry. That includes supplier contracts, port information, project specifications, regulatory and legislative developments, as well as articles and reports. And what you're seeing here is what we call our dashboard landing page from that product. The International Offshore Wind Partnering Forum, or IPF, is our signature event. It is known as one of the top 5 global offshore wind events. We'll be doing it virtually in the spring on the dates that you see here on your screen in April, May, and June. And we will be doing it together in Richmond, Virginia, August 24th to 26th. Foundation to Blade is our supply chain training course or manual that's aimed at helping companies figure out where they fit into the offshore wind supply chain. And we have partnered with a number of state governments to deliver this training, and we've already started that. It's been a great success. Finally, the Offshore Wind Supply Chain Connect is the network's offshore wind supply chain registry. What you're seeing here is our Supply Chain Connect product, but we also serve as the back end for a number of state government offshore wind supply chain registries. And a quick look here, this is the locations of some of the companies that are in our Supply Chain Connect. You'll see they're primarily focused in the Northeast United States, but also in the Gulf, with a little bit of development along the West Coast right now. So let's dive into the US market, right? Why does offshore wind make sense for the Northeast United States in particular? On the left side of your screen, you'll see that you have load centers, the Northeast corridor between Washington and Boston, that are in close proximity to the coast. And these are in states that are land constrained and for that reason are unable to deploy large scale onshore renewables. Then as you move to the center of the slide, you'll see that we have an excellent offshore wind resource that is in pretty close alignment with the locations of those load centers that I just mentioned. And then finally on the far right, you see that we have an excellent buildable environment. In other words, a wide, gently sloping outer continental shelf that for the most part, or at least the current iteration of projects, is well suited for fixed bottom deployment of offshore wind facilities. Now, a quick overview of the U.S. offshore wind structure. At the state level, they set the offshore wind capacity procurement targets. In other words, they create demand for offshore wind generated electricity. They conduct offshore wind capacity solicitations and evaluate project bids. And they also regulate the areas that are within 3 nautical miles of the coast, including and especially cable landfalls. Now, the federal government is responsible for delineating offshore wind lease areas, and they conduct auctions for those lease areas. And they're also responsible for conducting the federal permitting process, which includes site assessment plans, construction and operations plans. That agency is called the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, or BOEM. And there are a number of other entities and mission critical agencies at the federal level that are involved there. And then of course you have the private developers that are acquiring that site control from the federal government and securing power contracts, whether that's a PPA or an OREC from the state government. We're just going to show this slide really quickly because as you can see, we don't have any offshore wind lease areas in the Pacific yet, but we do have call areas, and the call areas are one of the initial steps before we get to the federal leasing process. But really, when we talk about the U.S. offshore wind market, we're talking about the East Coast. So let's zoom in there. This is the most current snapshot. This is the most current snapshot of the U.S. offshore wind market. The green highlighted lease areas are those projects that have received offtake, PPA or OREC, or a utility-driven project like the Dominion 2.6 gigawatt project. And in January, the state of New York selected 2 projects, both from Equinor with their strategic partner BP, and those are Empire Wind 2, which is here, and Beacon Wind, which is here. Now, as I mentioned a couple of slides ago, the state governments are the ones that set the offshore wind capacity procurement targets, and that is what this slide represents. And you can see that the state goals at this time, as of 2021, early February, the state goals stand at about 30 gigawatts by 2035. Now, as opposed to the state targets, and from the prior slide, this slide shows the megawatts that have been awarded offtake to date by state governments. And you'll see that that is about 11.6 gigawatts. and you'll see the Empire Wind 2 and Beacon Wind projects are the two most recently procured or selected projects by state governments, both of which are 1.2 gigawatt projects. Just to quickly touch on the BOEM timeline, the federal government's timeline, we are currently in the orange section, which is the review of the construction and operations plan. I'm sure many of you have heard about the Vineyard Wind project, and that is where we are standing right now, is BOEM is reviewing the construction and operations plan, and they need to issue an approval of that plan in order for that project to move towards financial close. Right behind the Vineyard Wind project, the Vineyard Wind project is an 800 megawatt project that's been procured by Massachusetts. Right behind Vineyard Wind is the South Fork Wind Farm project, which is going to interconnect to Long Island, and that is a 130 megawatt project. So these are just a few of the points of interconnections that have been identified by developers as to where they're going to be injecting their power into the onshore grid. But it's pretty well settled at this point, and this is something that we work on. The network published in October an offshore wind transmission paper that I would be happy to share with you that is available on our website. But it is pretty well settled at this point that significant upgrades are going to be required in order to integrate 30 gigawatts of offshore wind generation, those state cumulative goals, by 2035. It's very clear, and it's very clear that the incumbent generator lead line approach is really not going to be sufficient or capable of allowing us to achieve this level of capacity injection by 2035 to meet those state goals. Obviously, ports are another critical aspect of the offshore wind market in any country, but certainly in the United States. And we're already seeing the distribution of port facilities, including manufacturing facilities along the East Coast. And just a couple that I want to highlight in the last minute or so that I have. Siemens Gamesa has indicated that depending on the approval of that Dominion Energy utility scale project, a 2.6 gigawatt project, they may be siting a blade factory in Hampton Roads, Virginia. Then here, number 13, I'm from New Jersey, so I'm very proud to see my home state taking such significant action on offshore wind. The New Jersey Wind Port is a built from scratch facility that's intended to serve sort of all aspects of the offshore wind project development process, and that is going to be a new built port. You also have an EEW and Ørsted funded facility to manufacture monopiles here in Paulsboro, New Jersey. The South Brooklyn Marine Terminal is part of those recent projects that were awarded to Equinor, and they intend to do staging and perhaps O&M there. And then one that I really want to highlight is the Port of Coeymans, which is just south of Albany, New York. This is 100 miles north of the ocean. And Marmon and Welcon have announced a factory here to produce transition pieces and towers. So we're really excited to see the developments in manufacturing in the port facilities, as well as the other port developments along the East Coast. And finally, I encourage you to follow us on LinkedIn or YouTube, as well as Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at Offshore Wind US. And here is my contact information. Please do not hesitate to reach out to me via email or phone, and I look forward to your questions. So Ilya, back to you.
Okay, Brandon, thank you very much. It was a very informative and quick overview of the United States. Thank you very much. So now we have about 25 minutes for Q&A session, which is great. And we have received quite a few questions so far. So maybe the first question is a general one for all three of you. So what are the current challenges in the US, Vietnam, and Norway markets? So maybe Nasheena first, then Brandon, and then Johan.
All right.
Yeah.
There you go.
Yeah.
So yeah, touching on the challenges in Vietnam. So I think I've mentioned earlier on that there has been quite a number of challenges, but just to pick two of them is basically on the grid. Like the developers definitely are actually has real problem when it comes to grid connections, because according to the World Bank as well, the PDP 7, which is the Power Development Plan 7 that Vietnam is having right now, the transmission planning is definitely not sufficient for the offshore wind scenarios and the targets as well. And curtailment remains a really huge issue for the developers. So therefore, definitely we will need a lot of reinforcements as well as upgrades that would be included in the future PDP 8. As a way forward to better manage the grid connection. So just giving an example as well, for Vietnam's grid, they have a surge for their solar power. So this had applied a lot of pressure on the grid. And currently, their power utility, Vietnam's power utility, EVN, they are having problems in managing their renewables connection there. Hence, again, I want to emphasize that grid management is really essential to ensure all of the renewable projects get connected. So another problem would be the transmission development. It's actually monopolized by the power utility of Vietnam, EVN. However, we are seeing that the state as well has limited budget and they lack resources. So this actually hinders the grid expansion for renewable projects in general. So this basically intensifies the need to actually privatize the country's transmission business in order to meet the PDP 8's targets in the future. And I think another challenge would be the need to actually have to mandate a nodal regulatory body, because Vietnam doesn't have one right now, which is basically to act as a single point of contact to streamline the permitting as well as consent processes for the offshore wind projects. So yeah, I think these are the main challenges that Vietnam is facing for the time being.
Okay,
Hope
great.
answers the question.
Yeah. Okay, great. Brandon?
Yeah, so I will echo some of those concerns. One of them is the transmission planning, which I'll come back to in a moment. But I would say the number one challenge right now is that we have this backlog in the federal permitting approvals. In other words, the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management has 11 utility scale projects with that BOEM is currently reviewing the construction and operations plans, the COPs, for 11 projects. I mean, that is a significant number of projects, and in order to enhance the certainty that private investors need to make large investments into the U.S. offshore wind industry, those federal permitting approvals need to be forthcoming. And again, those permitting approvals allow the projects to move towards financial close. So we really have seen consistent commitments over the last several years by state governments, port investments, capacity procurements, workforce development, and research investments. But it's really been held up at the federal level because these projects are sited in federal waters, so the permitting approvals must be conducted by the federal government. So that's the first question, the first challenge. The second challenge would be that, as I showed on one of my slides, the states currently have collective goals together of about 30 gigawatts by 2035. And I'm talking the northeastern states, essentially between Cape Cod in the north and Massachusetts, and Cape Hatteras in the south and North Carolina. The challenge is that the acreage that's leased offshore there is only has a capacity of about 21 to 23 gigawatts, depending on who you ask. Obviously, that changes as individual turbine capacity increases, but it appears fairly clear to everyone in the industry here that the currently leased offshore acreage is going to be insufficient to meet those 30 gigawatt by 2035 goals. So you have a backlog of federal permitting. You also have a need for additional leasing of offshore areas. And then third, to echo some of the things that Nasheena said, there's really some shortcomings in transmission planning. Look at what's happening in Texas right now. We have a cold snap that has millions of Texans without power. The water in their toilets is freezing right now because they have no electricity. ERCOT, the Electricity Reliability Council of Texas, they have made a calculated decision to isolate their grid. And, you know, the political commentary now is that it's solely owing to wind generation freezing. And that simply is not the case. The reality is that the ERCOT grid is isolated from the other eastern and western interconnections and neighboring states. And the truth of the matter is that it's an example for why transmission planning is necessary to ensure reliability of delivery of electricity so that people literally do not die during extreme weather events. So the backlog of permitting approvals, need for additional offshore wind leasing, as well as a very clear need for transmission planning, not only for extreme weather events, but just in general to avoid curtailment and other issues like Nasheena identified.
Thank you, Brendan. Yeah, thank you very much. Johan?
Right. I think the Norwegian market is probably a little bit different compared to Viet Nam and the US. Grid can be an issue in some places, particularly on some of the more remote areas on the west coast of Norway. But for instance, in the south, where we would probably see this one of the two projects being connected into Norway, if it is connected to Norway, grid would probably not be such a big issue there. However, what I would say is the main issue for Norway is just the offtake situation. Simply because the Norwegian power system today doesn't really have any CO2 footprint. It's basically only hydropower in the Norwegian power mix, and therefore you don't have that as a fundamental driver. You also have a very low electricity price. So it's a different driver behind this. It's really the transition of the supply industry, and a lot of the Norwegian industry is relying on offshore oil and gas, and when we want to go through this transition, you need to give them the opportunity to go through that transition. So the question is just how to create a bankable project when there is currently no subsidy scheme in place. And therefore, I think for all of us who are trying to develop projects here, we are trying to be creative, trying to look at interconnections to other countries, if possible, trying to look at the offshore oil and gas industry as potential off-takers, because they do have not just a big CO2 footprint, but they also have a fairly high power price on their platforms. But it's a task with a lot of moving targets in it, and I think that would be the main challenge for these two projects in Norway.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. Thank you very much for all of your thoughts and sharing your ideas about challenges in all those three markets. And the next question will be also for all three of you. And what are the opportunities for floating offshore wind in all three markets? And also problems with the supply chain, possibly. So that's a combination of a couple of questions we received from the audience. And maybe Johan first this time, then Nasheena, and then Brendan.
Okay. Well, first of all, there are fantastic opportunities for floating wind in Norway. Norway has very deep waters, and the vast majority of the areas that could be suitable for offshore wind, I would say, is actually floating. So the combination of excellent wind resources, excellent sort of water depth. It's not ultra deep, more than 1,000 meters deep, but a few hundred meters deep, and also in many places quite okay grid connections and potential off-takers in the oil and gas industry. That is a good, I think, foundation for floating wind in Norway, certainly. And then from the supply chain point of view, it's also a very good situation in Norway. You have a number of excellent yards with a great deal of experience building steel structures for the oil and gas industry. And as I have mentioned before, the sort of local content question, which I think is a major question for the entire industry in all markets, is also very relevant in Norway. It's the key purpose for building offshore wind in Norway is to do, a transition of the local supply chain.
Okay, great, thank you. Nasheena?
All right, thank you for the question, Ilya. So definitely for the Asia Pacific region, there's a huge potential for floating offshore wind market. I've mentioned earlier on as well, for Japan, they really would like to emphasize on this particular technology because of their geographical conditions. So definitely, I agree with what Brandon mentioned earlier on as well. With the emerging floating offshore wind sector, especially in Japan and South Korea, highlight for this particular technology. This really opens up a new opportunities and markets for the oil and gas company. So they can technically leverage their existing experience in the offshore developments into this particular technology. So just to name an example as well, Shell is already starting to develop a floating offshore wind farm in South Korea. This is with the partner Cohen Hexicon. And a good example would be Aker Offshore as well. You mentioned early on that you're involved in a South Korea project. So there are really numerous opportunities for oil and gas companies to participate in the offshore wind sector. And this will really help to drive the energy transition movement as well forward. So for Vietnam as well, for their potential, there is in terms of technical potential, but for now they have not really gone into the floating offshore wind technology. But basically, just naming a few areas that would look into developing floating offshore wind definitely is in the central south of the Vietnam. Central south of Vietnam, where the technical potential is around 175 gigawatts of potential floating projects. So this is definitely highlighting the vast opportunity that is available for this particular technology to be implemented in the Southeast Asia region. So, yeah.
Okay, Nasheena, great. Thank you. Brandon?
Yeah, when we talk about floating offshore wind in the United States, I think everyone typically gravitates towards the West Coast, so California, Hawaii, Washington, Oregon. Certainly California is a market of interest. We have those call areas that have been identified off of the California coast. They are sorting out some issues with the Department of Defense, particularly dealing with the Central Coast. There's also been a call area outlined off of Humboldt County, which is near the border between California and Oregon. The challenge with Humboldt is that the transmission capacity there is not sufficient to deliver, gigawatts of power, and also the population, the electricity demand in Humboldt is not quite as high. That being said, California has an extremely high target in terms of its SB 100 goals. And just recently, there was legislation introduced that is proposing a 3 gigawatt offshore wind target for California by 2030 and 10 gigawatts by 2040. There are also 2 projects that have been proposed for California state waters near Vandenberg Air Force Base. But, and then we're also having conversations about Oregon. However, one thing that I want to stress is that the West Coast is not the only game in town in the U.S. for floating. In the Gulf of Maine, the state of Maine is looking to put a 12 megawatt floating turbine in state waters, as well as is exploring about 120 megawatt project that has been proposed for federal waters in the Gulf of Maine. But I think one of the things that I really want to highlight is that East Coast states already recognize that their the East Coast states that are already involved in offshore wind, I'm thinking New Jersey, New York, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Virginia, Maryland, states that are already involved in offshore wind recognize that their current goals are not high, their current offshore wind goals are not high enough to meet their full decarbonization objectives by 2050. New Jersey's goal, for example, right now is 7,500 megawatts by 2035. A report from the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection from 2020 has said that to get the full decarbonization, New Jersey alone is going to need 11 gigawatts of offshore wind. The truth of the matter is that as you start to run out of sea space, and so we really see areas further offshore the East Coast for deployment of floating technology as a real key opportunity as those states look to their longer goals for decarbonization. And then obviously the full decarbonization, typically 2050 target there. In terms of the supply chain, companies in the Gulf of Mexico, as well as the Gulf of Mexico and California have both deployed offshore oil and gas platforms, and we have a number of companies, as you saw in the supply chain registry, that have experience in those areas, manufacturing, deploying, maintaining, decommissioning offshore oil and gas platforms that are floating. So, we do see some real opportunities for retooling and transition from oil and gas to floating offshore wind for those companies in those regions.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. The next question is, Also for all three of you, with a special question for Brandon this time. What is the current status with auction for offshore wind in all three markets, the US, Vietnam, and Norway? And a couple of people specifically asked Brandon when leasing is going to start in the West Coast. So, and yeah, we can start with Brandon, then Johan, and Nasheena.
Okay, so I am loath to give you an exact date for when that leasing is going to start on the West Coast, but I would say that I would be surprised to see leasing on the West Coast happen during 2021. I'd love to be surprised, but I think that the Biden administration needs to get its feet under itself. But I will say that they made a very clear indication on, I believe it was January 27th, when they issued the order, the executive order wanting to double offshore wind capacity in federal waters by 2030. Certainly, they are moving to resolve those Department of Defense issues that I discussed earlier on the West Coast. A lot of things hinge on that. Certainly, a lot of people are working on that, especially at the California state level as well as in the federal government. However, I would encourage you to keep an eye on what's going on in the New York Bight, which is the area that's bounded on the north by Long Island and on the west by New Jersey. We already have 4 call areas that have been delineated there. And the call areas are the larger areas out of which the smaller offshore wind leases are delineated. So we expect that to be moving forward during 2021 if everything moves as we believe it should. Certainly that's my opinion, but at the same time, the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management new director is Amanda Lefton, who is a state energy secretary for Governor Andrew Cuomo in New York. So I think she fully understands the issue and fully understands the urgency of it. So certainly California in maybe the next year to 18 months, but keep a close eye on New York.
Okay, thank you very much. Johan?
Yeah, well, as I mentioned, I think during my presentation, we're all just waiting for these guidelines to be released by the government on the selection criteria and what type of criteria that they will use. So we're not sure exactly if this is going to be, an auction or some sort of multiple criteria evaluation like we see in some other countries. What I do think now is that the outcomes of round 4 in the UK that we saw a couple of weeks ago is sending some shockwaves almost through the industry, and the industry is currently digesting what happened there and what kind of implications that will have for other markets. So we saw less than a week later how Scotland actually put the brake on the ScotWind process to reevaluate the selection criteria, and we all just have to wait and see how this develops. But I think it's quite clear that particularly Norway, but probably also many other markets, they have a lot of different sort of desires with going for offshore wind. So one of them is clearly to create local jobs, local value creation, and to basically boost their economy with these projects. And then we'll probably see various types of auctions, and some of them will be capped or they will be scored in many different ways. And Norway is just one of those countries where we'll have to wait and see how it's all going to be scored.
Okay, Johan, thank you. Nasheena?
All right, so for Vietnam, I think that don't go by auctions, but a lot of the projects are situated in the southwest region of Vietnam. So that's mainly in Binh Thuan and in Thuan. And earlier on, I mentioned about the Binh Dinh project as well. That's one of the projects that has just recently stepped into the limelight, which is end of last year. So definitely that is a project that I would keep my eye on. And also the other mega project, which is the Thang Long projects. These are the large scale projects that everybody is having their eyes on right now. But in terms of auctions for Japan, I just want to highlight as well, they have I mentioned earlier on in my presentation, they have released their first floating offshore wind auction, which is launched last year as well. So that's something to look forward to. And in terms of fixed bottom foundations, in July 2020, they have already launched an auction, nominated 4 offshore wind zones. So definitely Japan is another market to look into in terms of opportunity for offshore development, both bottom fixed as well as the floating foundations.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Nasheena. The next question is also for all three of you. What are the local requirements in the US, Vietnam, and Norway markets? So we can go with Nasheena first, then Brandon and Johan.
Sorry. So basically for Vietnam, in terms of the local content, I have not I don't really have a clear percentage of how the local content would be, but basically based on my understanding for projects such as Lagan Offshore Wind Farm, this is a mega scale 3.4 gigawatts of generation capacity. It's expected around 65%, around 50 to 60% of local content. Because just to highlight as well the supply chain for Vietnam, they have a good engineering workforce. This is especially from the expertise in their shipbuilding and oil and gas sector, which can easily be integrated into the offshore wind industry. Although there are no Vietnamese operated jackup vessels, there are actually other heavy lift vessels from the oil and gas sector that could also carry out foundation and substation installations. So I think, yeah, local content wise, definitely no clear percentage, but there's a huge opportunity for the local companies as well to take part in the mega projects or even the small scale projects that they have in Vietnam right now, especially with their expertise in the balance of plant scope, transportation, installation, O&Ms, and so forth. So yeah.
Okay, Nasheena, thank you very much. Brandon?
Yeah, unfortunately, I have a pretty similar answer. Pretty much all of these local content requirements are set on a state-by-state basis, so it varies between every state, and frankly, sometimes it can vary between states, first, second, third, etc. offshore wind capacity solicitations. But speaking generally, the states that have elected to utilize the OREC, or Offshore Wind Renewable Energy Credit or Certificate, depending on which state you're in, those are New Jersey, New York, and Maryland. They have opted for higher levels of local content in their project bids, but that has the result of a higher per megawatt hour price for those projects. By contrast, your straight PPA states, Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Rhode Island, they still certainly see local content outcomes, but they have placed less of a policy priority on it relative to New York, New Jersey, and Maryland. But what I can say is that Massachusetts is currently reformulating its approach, and just last week it released a draft draft solicitation document for its third offshore wind capacity solicitation that includes additional requirements. So we're still digesting those. But the point remains that the Mayflower Wind Project is a Massachusetts wind project that has the lowest per megawatt hour price of any U.S. offshore wind commercial scale or utility scale project. That's significantly owing to the fact that the bid that was selected prioritized lowest price over higher quantities of local content. So the short answer is it varies between states, and it also changes in the state over time. So.
Okay, great. Thank you, Brandon. And Johan?
Yeah, so in Norway, it hasn't been communicated a specific target or a specific figure for local content. But I think, as I mentioned several times now, that the purpose of building offshore wind in Norway is really to give the supply chain a chance to transition. It's obvious that it will be a major factor for sort of evaluating bidders to develop the projects. I think obviously the turbines you can't really do very much about. They normally come from Germany or Denmark. But the rest of the of the project, balance of plant and cables and all the rest of it is quite a clear expectation that much of that should come from Norway, I think. So that's a fair assumption to make.
Okay, great. So thank you very much for all your answers and sharing views. That's already brings us to the end of the webinar. Unfortunately, we still have lots of questions, but Unfortunately, the time is over for this webinar. Thank you very much for those extremely informative presentations. Thanks Johan, Nasheena, and Brendan for your time today. And thanks everyone for attending the session. Please join our next month webinar. It's going to be on floating, and the name for it is the current and future challenges for floating offshore wind. And it's going to happen exactly in a month from now on March 18th. So have a great rest of the day, everyone, and bye for now.